I've worked in international teams long enough to notice a pattern. Americans don't usually offend people on purpose. It's almost never malice. It's more like the volume is calibrated differently, the social rules are different, and the confidence is so automatic that it doesn't register as a choice. And then you watch the same misunderstandings happen again and again, just in different accents and different cities. One evening, we were out with a client in London, and my American coworker, Megan, was genuinely stunned when he said Americans can be exhausting in restaurants. Megan bristled immediately. She thought he was calling Americans unfriendly, so she defended it as, "We're just outgoing and Europeans are so stiff." The client didn't argue aggressively. He just explained it like a simple courtesy rule. It's not about being social. It's about noticing other people exist. If the whole room can hear your private conversation, you're not being warm. You're taking over the space. Megan looked honestly confused, like the idea of lowering your voice for strangers felt unfair, even restrictive. The rest of dinner she tried to whisper, and you could see she felt like she'd been punished for having a personality. That same "I'm being friendly" logic shows up in service culture all the time. I once watched an American tourist in Italy complain that the staff weren't smiling enough, as if a neutral face automatically equals hostility. I explained that here, service is treated more like a profession than a performance. Polite, efficient, not fake cheerful on command. He asked the question Americans always ask next. But how do they get tips? When I told him tipping isn't meant to force someone into a constant grin for survival, he looked offended, like I'd insulted a sacred tradition. He left a nasty review about rude staff, when what he really meant was, nobody acted like a paid friend. Privacy is another one. At a hostel in Amsterdam, an American guest complained that Europeans are cold because nobody shares their entire life story 5 minutes after meeting. She said Americans are open, Europeans are closed off, like it was a moral difference. I tried to explain that here, not oversharing immediately is considered respectful. People warm up gradually. Friendship grows. It isn't speed run. She couldn't understand it. To her, instant intimacy was proof of kindness, and anything slower felt like rejection. Watching that, you realize how many Americans confuse intensity with closeness. Work culture is where the gap turns into an argument. At a business conference, my American colleague asked a German partner why Europeans care so much about vacation. The German guy didn't even flinch. He said, "We're not obsessed with time off. We're obsessed with having an actual life." He explained that work is supposed to support living, not swallow it. When he called 60-hour weeks sad, my colleague took it personally, like he'd insulted her character. She saw long hours as virtue, proof of ambition. He saw them as a system failing its people, and instead of considering that perspective, she walked away muttering that Europeans are lazy, because that's safer than admitting the American version might be unhealthy. Even basic small talk turns into a clash. Americans often treat personal questions as warmth. Where are you from? What do you do? Why aren't you married yet? And they're shocked when other cultures don't mirror it. They'll say, "We're just being friendly," while missing that friendliness can also mean giving someone space. It's like they've been taught that connection has to be immediate and loud to be real, and if it's quiet, it must be fake. Food becomes a battlefield, too. I've seen Americans get defensive over things they grew up with. Bread, for example. A French exchange student once joked that American bread tastes like dessert. A neighbor of mine practically took it as a personal attack. She insisted that sweet, soft supermarket bread is classic, and anyone who criticizes it is a snob. When the student explained that bread isn't supposed to taste sugary or last forever because of additives, she didn't hear different standard. She heard insult. She said Americans improved bread by making it sweeter and longer lasting, like preservatives are an innovation, not a compromise. And I remember thinking, this is the same conversation Americans have about everything. If it's familiar, it must be better, and anyone who disagrees must be jealous. And then there's the global awareness problem, the one that makes people abroad roll their eyes even when they're trying to be polite. I've watched an American student in an international program get upset because classmates said Americans seem uninformed about the world. She didn't deny it. She justified it. She literally said, We're the most important country. Why would we need to know about everywhere else? Someone from Norway replied calmly, "That attitude is exactly why you seem uneducated." She ended up leaving the program convinced everyone was bullying her, not realizing they were reacting to the confidence without curiosity vibe. All of these moments look different on the surface: volume, smiling, privacy, vacation, bread. But the engine underneath is the same. Americans often assume their defaults are universal, and when they aren't, it doesn't feel like culture difference. It feels like criticism. And when criticism hits a national identity built on being the standard, the reflex isn't curiosity, it's defense. The more I watched it, the more I realized the real issue isn't that Americans do things wrong. It's that a lot of Americans genuinely believe their way is the baseline, and everyone else is either behind, jealous, or unnecessarily complicated. That mindset doesn't sound aggressive when it's spoken with a smile, but it still lands like arrogance. And what's crazy is they often don't even feel arrogant. They feel entitled to be understood. Language is a perfect example. I once overheard an American tourist at a European airport complaining that nobody speaks American, not English, American. A British traveler nearby corrected him, "You mean nobody speaks English with your accent?" The American got irritated and started explaining with total confidence that American is different, that Americans fixed English by making it simpler and more logical. The Brit's reply was basically, "You changed spelling and pronunciation, but it's still English, and you didn't invent the language." The American stormed off muttering like he'd been robbed of credit. It was absurd, but it was also the same pattern. Take something shared, claim ownership, then act offended when people don't clap. Education triggers the same reflex. I've heard Europeans describe American universities as expensive daycare for adults, and American students react like you've insulted their family. But when you lay out the structure, huge tuition, dorm life, administrators managing everything, campus bubble that delays adulthood, it's not an insane critique. A German student once said, "You pay a fortune to live in a supervised environment and call it independence." The American student didn't debate the details, she got angry at the framing. Because in the American mind, college isn't just education, it's identity, nostalgia, status. Questioning it feels like questioning the whole ladder. Healthcare is where the international reaction becomes less teasing and more moral disgust. I've been at conferences where doctors from multiple countries looked genuinely disturbed by how the U.S. system works. An American physician will say the classic line, "Best doctors, best tech," and a Canadian or Dutch doctor will answer with something painfully simple. Outcomes aren't better, costs are higher, and tying care to profit means the poor get punished for being poor. That's not efficient, it's cruel. Americans often respond with the same defense. Universal care is socialism, as if the only two options are freedom or collapse. And the shock on their faces when the room doesn't agree is real. They expect the world to envy them, and instead the world looks at them like, "Why are you letting this happen?" Business culture is another place where Americans burn bridges without realizing it. In Tokyo, I watched an American businessman get frustrated because meetings didn't jump straight into numbers. He called the relationship building wasting time. His Japanese partner tried to explain that trust comes before transactions, that rushing is disrespect. The American kept repeating the same mantra, "Time is money," like saying it enough times would make it universally true. He didn't understand that in many cultures, the fastest way to lose money is to signal you don't value people. He lost the deal, and he still thought it was inefficient tradition, not his own cultural blindness. Even when someone points out American patriotism, it rarely turns into self-reflection. It turns into a loyalty test. I've seen Canadians and Europeans describe constant flags and daily pledges as cultish from the outside, and Americans react like they've been attacked. One American roommate of mine got offended and said other countries are just jealous and don't have anything worth being proud of. That right there is the line between love and superiority. Most nations don't need daily rituals to prove they belong to their country. They just belong. When an American hears that, they don't hear different expression. They hear lack of love. And then they get mean. The same thing happens with American friendliness. Australians, Scandinavians, even Brits will sometimes say Americans feel fake friendly. Big smile, instant personal questions. then suddenly cold the moment it's inconvenient. An American will insist, no, we're genuinely warm. But the critique isn't that Americans can't be kind. It's that kindness gets packaged like customer service. Like there's a script: smile, overshare, act close fast. And then when the relationship asks for real consistency, patience, boundaries, loyalty, some people drop it because the performance is over. That's why outsiders call it superficial. Not because it's evil, but because it's sometimes more about vibe than substance. And once you notice that, you start seeing a theme across everything. Americans are trained to treat discomfort as oppression. Lower your voice in a restaurant? You're being silenced. Don't interrogate strangers immediately. People are cold. Don't force servers to grin for tips. Service is bad. Take time off? You're lazy. Build trust before business? It's inefficient. The default assumption is that any limit is an attack on freedom, even when the limit is simply consideration for others. What makes it sad is that so much of this comes from insecurity, not strength. I've heard Scandinavian clients tell Americans, gently, that Americans seem stressed and unhappy despite claiming they live in paradise. And the American response is always defensive. We're happy. We have freedom and opportunity. But then someone will point out the obvious. People working constantly, fearing medical bills, worrying about job security, living with bankruptcy anxiety. And suddenly the shiny story looks like a mask. Outsiders don't envy that. They pity it. And here's the part Americans hate. The world doesn't see American confidence as inspiring when it isn't backed by curiosity, humility, or self-awareness. It reads as loud certainty sitting on top of gaps in knowledge. I've literally watched an American tourist prove the stereotype in real time, asking if a cafe takes French dollars, wondering why menus aren't in English, then insisting a whole country should accommodate him because it's a tourist place. That isn't worldly. That's entitlement with a suitcase. So when people abroad say Americans can be loud, demanding, culturally unaware, or obsessed with work and money, it isn't always meant as an insult. Sometimes it's a description of a system that trained people to perform confidence instead of building understanding. And the tragedy is, if Americans could drop the performance for 5 minutes, they might actually learn something. And they might even become the kind of country they keep loudly claiming to be.